Good morning, and thank you for joining us. This is Paul Watkins, the Program Administrator with the Mobile Housing Authority Housing Choice Voucher Program. And this morning we'll be going through our voucher briefing presentation to share about the program and how it works. And for our families who are will receive a voucher, this will be a thorough explanation of the program. So thank you for joining us this morning, and we will get started. First off, what is the Housing Choice Voucher Program? The HCV program is the federal government's largest program for assisting low-income families. Our purpose is to help families afford decent, safe, and sanitary housing in the private marketplace. So for Mobile, anywhere in Mobile County is accessible to families through our program to secure housing. Participants are able to find their own housing. That certainly includes single-family homes, townhomes, and apartments. The participant is free to choose any housing that meets the requirements of the program, and it's not limited to units located in subsidized housing projects, as you might find in our low-income public housing program. We're going to use as an example this morning May. May is an HCV participant. Tell you a little bit about May. She's 41 years old. She's single and she's the head of household. May has two children, Daniel, who is 14, and Joe, who is 18, and Joe is also a full-time student. So we'll use May as our example today to walk through how the program works for May. And of course, how it will work for you. So what are the steps in leasing under the Housing Choice Voucher Program? So there's about 10 steps that I'll walk through just as a brief overview. First is to apply for assistance, okay? You first have to apply for housing assistance. Most families have joined our wait list. Once you're selected from our wait list, then you move to step 2, which is screening and verification to determine eligibility. So you all have completed this step, which is why we now have you on this voucher briefing that'll walk you through from soup to nuts, as they say, of the program. After you've been screened, eligible participants are notified of their eligibility and invited to attend the briefing session. That's today. Congratulations. Step 4 is you'll be issued a voucher. So following this voucher briefing, you'll receive announcement, a notification via email of the time and date to come pick up your voucher, okay? After you receive your voucher, step 5, then you're free to conduct a housing search, okay? That's simply going out into the marketplace with your voucher to look for a property of your choosing, okay? Once you select a unit, you'll complete and submit your leasing packet. We'll talk about what the leasing packet is later on in the presentation. You'll get with your landlord, you'll complete and then submit to Mobile Housing Authority your leasing packet. After your leasing packet has been accepted, then the agency will schedule and inspect the unit. Accepted is very important. We walk through a process when we review your leasing packet to make sure that it is, number 1, thoroughly completed and all the information is present. 2, we want to make sure that the property, what we call rates for the amount of rent that the landlord is requesting. We want to make sure that that's appropriate, right? We don't want you paying too much. We want to make sure it's affordable for you and that the rent is reasonable based on the condition of the property, the specifics of the property, and the area that the property is located. Once that has been determined, and we are comfortable that the property meets both of those guidelines, that it's affordable for you and that it's reasonable in its rent, then we will accept it, right? Once the packet has been accepted, then we'll schedule and inspect the unit. Step 8, after we inspect the unit, then we will move forward in our process. Step 9, once the unit is inspected and the rents are approved, the lease and the HAP contract are signed. You will sign the lease and we will sign the HAP contract with the landlord. And then step 10, the agency will begin making HAP payments for the unit. Of course, that means you're actually moving in. So that is essentially an overview of the leasing process. So what is a voucher? Your voucher gives you the opportunity to search for a unit. Landlords must also be approved by the agency, right? We just talked about that a little bit. We'll get into that a little bit more later on. So what is on the voucher? What is some important information that's on the voucher? First off, it's the number of bedrooms that you have been approved and eligible for. Secondly, it is the time that your voucher is available for use. Most families' vouchers are available for 90 days initially in the marketplace. You get your voucher, it's good for 90 days. If you need an extension, you can receive an extension. You have to request an extension. We don't know that you want to remain in the search process. If your 90 days is coming to an end, you need to let us know in advance of your 90 days coming to an end that, hey, I'd like to continue to search for a property. May I receive an extension? In most cases, the answer is yes, you'll receive an extension for another 30 days. So you have a maximum time period of 120 days to utilize your voucher in the marketplace to search for housing. That's 4 months. Most families that are diligent about finding property and finding a place to live will locate a place within 4 months. Okay, so all of that information is reflected on the voucher. So give you a little bit of insight on how the search term works. So the voucher is valid, as I mentioned, for 4 months, 120 days. When you submit your request for tenancy approval or your leasing packet, when you submit that to us, right, that means you found a place and the landlord, you have agreed on the rent and you've walked through the property, you like it, hey, you're ready to move forward, you submit your rafter or leasing packet to us. When you submit it, the voucher clock stops. So let's say you're at day 90 and you found your place. We will put a hold. The clock will stop on your voucher, meaning that extra 30 days will not expire, right? Your voucher will stop. We will walk through the process. We call this tolling or suspending your voucher while we walk through the approval process for your unit. Let's say for some reason your unit doesn't rate, the rent is not reasonable, or the unit fails inspection, not just once, but 2 times, and you're forced to move on to find another property. Well, you will get your voucher back, and then your date will be updated on your voucher to reflect the remaining time that you have in your voucher. Hopefully that makes sense. You got your voucher, you used it for 60 days, you found a property, we stop the clock on that voucher. For some reason, the property falls out. Let's say that's 60 days later, the property falls out, you're not able to find the property. You're not able to move into that property. We will then reissue you that same voucher, extend the time period to extend the date to reflect the remaining time period that you have in your voucher. That way you don't lose any time while you're going through the rafter process. Talked about voucher extensions just a second ago. If you've not found a property, you may request a voucher extension to a maximum of 120 days. Requests should be submitted before the voucher's expiration date, and typically will require you to document the extenuating circumstances in writing, so we have that as part of our record for extending your voucher. Okay. Talked about this. As the HCV program participant, you are responsible for monitoring the date expiration date of your voucher. If you're unable to locate a unit, you must communicate with us. Talk to us about that, okay? I always read the Fair Housing. Keep this in mind as you go out into the marketplace. The Fair Housing Act protects you from being discriminated against in the sale, rental, financing, or insuring of housing based on your protected class. Protected classes include race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, familial status, military status. It's also state protected, and sexual orientation, which is a local protection. MHA complies with these laws, and we expect the landlords in the HCV program to do so as well. If you believe you're being discriminated against, you have the right to make a complaint. The voucher in your briefing package, Fair Housing is Your Right, will help guide you in this process. Some of the advocacy agencies within the state of Alabama, and certainly here in Mobile, are South Alabama Center for Fair Housing, Legal Services for Alabama, and Alabama Disabilities Advocate Program. Okay, and there are their websites there. You can take a picture of that, a screenshot of that, if in fact, or just contact us later if in fact you feel like you're being discriminated against. Let's talk about persons with disabilities. If your household includes a person with disabilities, the MHA will make efforts to assist you. Families who may need what we call reasonable accommodations or assistance locating units with accessibility features. For example, of reasonable accommodation features, they include an additional bedroom for a live-in aid. They also include a higher payment standard for wheelchair accessible units. Requesting a reasonable accommodation. If you wish to request a reasonable accommodation, please talk to our housing specialists. But anyone in our office can assist you. You just need to let us know that if you'd like to request a reasonable accommodation. You'll be asked to provide some contact information for a knowledgeable professional, usually a medical provider, so that MHA can verify the need for the reasonable accommodation. And then you'll be notified in writing of the outcome of your request. If you need language assistance, please let us know. This includes sign language. We'll be more than glad to help you with that. Violence Against Women's Act. Under the Violence Against Women's Act, or VAWA, MHA provides some protections for persons, not just women, who are victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Okay, MHA will provide a notice about what kinds of protections you have under VAWA and how to access this help. As an example, if you need emergency transfer because you're a victim of domestic violence, you can make a VAWA transfer request. If you'd like to request VAWA protections, please let us know as soon as possible. We do have representatives who can provide you with the forms to complete the process for your VAWA claim. You certainly will be asked to provide some verifying information needed for the VAWA claim, okay? Compliance. This is important. Like any government assistance program, MHA depends on the honesty of its clients. Signing your name to false information to obtain housing is considered fraud. If you commit fraud to obtain housing from MHA, you could be subject to eviction, fines, and termination of your voucher assistance. To prevent any misunderstandings that may result in fraud, please ask us if you don't understand something on the application or the recertification forms. I'll just make a note here. We say to prevent any misunderstandings. Sometimes it's not the intention to commit fraud. Sometimes you just don't quite understand what you can and cannot do. Okay, and so it's just important to communicate with us. We will let you know if something you're trying to do is not proper. And if it is proper and you just don't know how to do it, we'll tell you how to do it. Okay. And then, of course, we'll tell you the repercussions of doing that. I always use a simple example. If you want to add someone to your voucher or have someone live with you that becomes a part of your household, that's fine. You're perfectly able to do that. You simply need to add them to your voucher. Okay. Some families have folks living with them who they don't add to their voucher. And then we get notification of that by the landlord or through some other means. And then it's a problem because you need to let us know if someone is living with you that's a part of your household. They need to be on your voucher. Now, if you're doing that and you don't want us to know because they're earning income and you don't want that income counted against you, then, that's tantamount to fraud, right? Because you understand that, hey, if their income is included on my voucher, then I may not get the same level of assistance. And if you're trying to skate around that, then that's a problem. So just be mindful of that. Most things people want to do, you actually can do. The government does not regulate who you have as part of your household. What we do want to know is, in fact, who is a part of your household. We want you to tell us. And if that means you don't need as much assistance because you have folks who are living with you who are earning income and can contribute to the rent, then that's just the results of having folks live with you who are earning income. So hopefully that little example helps you understand what we mean by to prevent any misunderstandings that could result in fraud. Just communicate with us so we can help you through that process. Accurate reporting of income and family composition. So this is the regulation, the requirement around that. You must follow the agency's reporting requirement. It's not just ours, it's HUD's. Okay, the agency has access to government databases which provide information on your wages and certain benefit payments that you receive. We do compare this information to the information you report to ensure the accuracy and completeness of your reporting. In other words, tell us the truth. We will more than likely find out anyway. And it's not a friendly conversation. It's not a nice conversation to have if we find out you have a lot more income than you've reported to us. Okay, the results of that usually aren't in your favor. Again, the second bullet here, I just kind of gave that example. If you have new people staying in your unit, or if a family member leaves your unit, that's the other side of that, right? And you do not report these changes, you are in violation of program rules and may lose your assistance. So just, again, communicate with us if you have family members or household members that leave your household or join your household. So we're going to walk through a couple of terms here to help you with an understanding of, again, how the program works and what it means that really answers questions that a lot of families will have. So we're going to talk about subsidy standard. Subsidy standards are what MHA uses to determine your voucher size. So the question that we always get is, what size voucher will I get? Right? We get that question from every family and every new participant. What's going to be the size of my voucher? Okay, and this is how we determine the size of your voucher. It's through the subsidy standard. Subsidy standards provide for the smallest number of bedrooms needed to house a family without overcrowding. So we don't allow any more than 2 persons per bedroom. So I'll say that again. We allow a maximum of 2 persons per bedroom to be in each bedroom. The number of bedrooms assigned to your voucher, and hence to you, will depend on how many members are in your family and the relationship between the people in the household, right? So keep that in mind. We're going to use an example. We're going to walk through an example of that in just a second. Okay. So below is a high-level summary of the subsidy standards used to determine your voucher size. For subsidy standards determination, an adult is age 21 or older. Okay. So here we go. Here's how we break it down. Family members of the opposite sex, other than spouses or partners, will be allocated separate bedrooms. Adults will be allocated 1 bedroom per adult. If 2 adults consider themselves partners, then they will go into 1 bedroom, husband and wife, or who you consider your partner, right? Then you'll go into 1 bedroom, right? 2 children of the same sex will be required to share a bedroom. 2 boys, 2 girls. They're going to go into the same bedroom if they're children. An adult will not be required to share a bedroom with a child. So we get that question a lot, right? I've got a newborn. Do I have to share the bedroom with a newborn? No, you don't. An adult will not be required to share a bedroom with a child. If you have 2 or 3 adults that are not in relationship to each other, they're not spouses or partners, then each of those adults will get their own bedroom. If you have 2 children and they are of the same sex, then they'll bunk up. They'll be in the same bedroom. If you have 2 children that are of opposite sex, then each one of those children will get their own bedroom. So hopefully that's pretty clear, and you can then look at your own household when you complete your application, or you've completed your application already by now, right? So you've completed your application. So you'll know the answer to this question even before you get your voucher. You just simply go through who's in your household, who's an adult, who are partners, right? Okay, the partners they'll be in 1 bedroom, all the other adults will be in separate bedrooms. And then you look to your children and you say, okay, are they of the same sex? Remember, no more than 2 per bedroom, right? And then you can allocate the bedrooms accordingly. So let's look at an example of our subsidy standard in action. We're going to go back to May. This is our representative for this example. So let's look at May. May has what? 2 sons, right? Age 14 and 18. So May is eligible for a 2-bedroom voucher. She will have her own bedroom and her sons will share a room. Why? Because they're both boys. They have the same sex. And it's just 2 of them, right? So they'll go into 1 bedroom and May will have her own bedroom. So we often get this question as well. I've now got a voucher, but I don't want to live in Mobile. I don't want to live in Mobile County. In fact, I don't want to live in the state. I want to move somewhere else. Okay, you are free to do that. That's called portability. Okay, so what is portability? In the HCV program, remember, HCV program is a federal program, which means this program is nationwide, right? In the HCV program, when a participant wants to move outside of their PHA's jurisdiction, Mobile Housing Authority, our jurisdiction is Mobile County, okay? This process is called portability. Applicants and participants who have resided within the MHA jurisdiction for the last 12 months preceding their request to port out to another public housing authority's jurisdiction. When you request to port out to another jurisdiction, when you are admitted to the HCV program, including when you receive a tenant protection voucher, doesn't really apply to you here, you must be determined to be income eligible in the receiving jurisdiction. In other words, just because you are approved based on your income here doesn't mean you'll be approved based on your income in a different jurisdiction. Every jurisdiction has its own income requirements. So wherever you're porting to, it's important to know what are the income limits for that jurisdiction. And do you meet those income limits? Now, if you do, then no problem, you'll be able to port. If you don't, however, then you won't be able to use your voucher in that other jurisdiction. A few other things about this. When you port out to another housing authority in another county or state, you will have to follow the policies of that housing authority. You'll no longer be under the policies of MHA, you'll be under the policies of whatever housing authority is in the jurisdiction that you're going to, right? Specifically in a couple of matters. Number one, there may be different screening and subsidy standards and payment standards, which we'll talk about here in a second. But another jurisdiction may have different screening and subsidy standards that we do here. So for instance, if the subsidy standard you qualify for here results in you having a 3-bedroom voucher, if you port to another housing authority, okay, with different policies on unit sizes, you may only be eligible for a 2-bedroom voucher. And so that's just the result of, again, being under the authority or being under the jurisdiction of another housing authority. You have to follow their policies. So hopefully that's clear. So portability and background screenings. Housing authorities generally conduct a criminal background screening on all adult family members who are porting into their jurisdiction. Okay, these are part of the screening requirements that I just mentioned. Okay, all HCV programs are required by federal regulation to review the National Sex Offender Registry on adult family members who are porting into their jurisdiction. Housing authorities may, in fact, have different criminal background screening policies. And so you just, again, have to be aware of that. So when you're porting out to another jurisdiction, you'll have to pass their criminal background screenings, not just you, right? But anyone who's an adult in your family, in your household. They all have to go through this process. And again, what this means is you may not be eligible to port into a specific housing authority based on its policies regarding criminal background screening. All right, so we've covered subsidies standard. We've covered portability. So you know how we are going to determine the size of your voucher. Okay, now you also know, and you've heard how if you want to move to a different jurisdiction, how that works. Let's talk about utility allowances. Okay, so MHA provides for tenant-based or tenant-paid utilities based on housing of similar size and type in the town or city where you choose to live throughout Mobile County. The utility allowance is updated each year. Okay, so not only do we provide assistance for rental payment, right, the actual rent, but we also provide assistance for the utilities that are associated with that property. All right. So utility allowance information will be provided in your briefing packet. You may also find it on the MHA website. Let's talk a little bit more about it. If you will be responsible for paying utilities in your new unit, you must set up your utility accounts. Okay, so that's pretty obvious, right? The landlord is not going to pay for your utilities when you move into a property in most cases. Okay, so they're going to be tenant paid utilities. So in order to get utilities turned on, you've got to have an account, right? So what's important to note about this is that we, Mobile Housing Authority, also require that you establish a utility account, right? And whoever the head of the household's name is. That's very important, and I'll tell you why in a second. We recommend that you only do this after your unit has been approved by the agency, it's passed the inspection, and you're ready to move in. Please do not turn on the utilities to a property prior to MHA approving and inspecting and it passing the inspection process. Please do not turn on the utilities to the property until you have signed the lease. You don't want to have utilities in your name for a property that you are not moving into. Hopefully that's pretty basic. Sometimes we have heard that landlords will ask participants to turn on the utilities in their name to do the inspection that MHA performs on every property. Do not do that. I want to make sure that's clear for the record. Do not turn on the property's utilities in your name prior to you signing the lease. Okay? When we do an inspection, it is the landlord's responsibility to have the utilities turned on so we can make sure appliances and things in the property work. Okay? If they don't work and the property fails the inspection and there's repairs that's needed, then the landlord will be required to make those repairs. Sometimes those repairs can be costly, especially if you have a crew that's going to be in there utilizing the power. You don't want that utility bill in your name accruing expenses on a property that you haven't even moved into yet. Okay. So I emphasize this because we've had this happen. And unfortunately, because we've let you know there's not much we can do for you, you just have to make sure that you protect yourself in that regard. Okay. So the landlord will tell you which utility companies to contact when you are ready to move in to turn on those utilities. Okay. Please call them and set up the utilities in the name of the head of house. Now, why is that? Utility assistance payments are made directly to the utility company. We only make one. It's made to Alabama Power. It comes directly from MHA and it goes directly to Alabama Power. It's for the benefit of the person who's on the voucher, the head of house, right? So very important that you establish the utility account in the person who's the head of house on the voucher. Hopefully this makes sense. When we issue a check to Alabama Power, we issue that check on the head of household, on the head of house name. Whoever's the voucher holder. That's what I mean when I say the head of house. Whoever is the voucher holder, that's who we are sending a check to Alabama Power on their behalf, right? If you don't have an account with Alabama Power, then guess what happens to that check? Alabama Power sends it back to us because Alabama Power says, we don't know who to apply this to. There's no account set up in the name of this person. They might have a different name set up for that address. And they can't accept that money if it's under a different name. And we can't put that check under a different name. It has to go in the name of the voucher holder, the head of house. So please make sure, again, I only emphasize this because we've had people to not do that and then wonder why they're not getting the assistance that they qualify for and should receive. Well, because you put the utilities under somebody else's name. Okay. Don't do that. Put it into your name if you're the voucher holder so that when we send a check, it cashes with Alabama Power and is applied to your account. Hopefully that makes good sense. Payment standards. Let me go back one additional time, and we'll hit this later on, but I want to say it now. The other reason is when we do our HQS inspections, if the power is not turned on at the property, then we cannot make a fair and accurate determination if the property is safe, decent, and sanitary. What if there's an electrical problem, right? We won't be able to tell that if there's no power. And so we cannot have any of our participants living in a property where there is no power. Okay? Why? Because that can be dangerous. If there's no power, then you are deemed to not be living in a property that is safe, decent, and sanitary. Okay? If we find out, and we do find out pretty quickly, because when we send that first check over to Alabama Power and they send it back to us saying we don't have an account in this person's name for this address, then we know. And we will send you notice that you have 10 days to turn the power on in your name, or else you could be subject to termination from the program. Termination from the program. We don't want you to be terminated from the program because the utilities aren't turned on in your name. But if they're not turned on in your name, then we're left to assume that you don't have power. And if you don't have power, then that can create an unsafe living environment. Would not pass HQS inspection, and you'd be terminated from the program as a result. Okay? So again, just make sure you get the utilities turned on in your name. Thank you. Now let's move forward. Payment standards. So we talked about subsidy standards. We've talked about portability. We've talked about utilities. Now the question is always, well, how much money do I have in my voucher? Right? So that's our payment standards. That's always the second question. How big is my voucher going to be? Right? How many bedrooms are going to be in my voucher? And then how much money is going to be in this voucher? So here's what answers that question. It's our payment standard. So the payment standard is the highest amount of subsidy that the agency will pay toward your unit for rent and utilities. Remember I said that just a second ago, right? We pay both rent and utilities. Okay, that's what we provide assistance towards. Right? The maximum amount of subsidy that MHA is going to pay toward your rent and utilities is determined by our payment standard. All right. So each agency, depending on its location throughout the country, may have different payment standards. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, sets the fair market rents for each jurisdiction each and every year. Okay, we, the housing authority, determine the payment standard based on that fair market rent that HUD establishes for each jurisdiction. The agency applies the payment standard for the number of bedrooms in the unit or voucher size, whichever is smaller. All right. So, for example, you've got a 2-bedroom unit, but your voucher is only good for 1 bedroom. The agency is going to apply the 1-bedroom payment standard to your unit. Why? Because you were issued a voucher for a 1-bedroom voucher. Just because you want to choose a 2-bedroom voucher doesn't mean it gets bumped up. You've been approved for a 1-bedroom voucher. A copy of the current payment standard will be provided in your briefing package. You can also go online to our website to find that information as well. So let's look at an example of how this plays out. Let's go back to May. Remember, May is eligible for a 2-bedroom unit, right? So she's going to have a payment standard that's based on what? A 2-bedroom unit, right? What if May wants to live in a 3-bedroom unit so her sons don't have to share a room? So what if she wants to do that? Remember, MHA is going to provide assistance based on the 2-bedroom voucher payment standard that we issued to May. If the 3-bedroom unit is more expensive than the 2-bedroom unit, then she would be responsible for paying the amount above the 2-bedroom payment standard. Remember, the payment standard is the maximum amount of subsidy we're going to put towards rent and utilities. If that 3-bedroom unit costs more than the 2-bedroom payment standard allows for, then she's responsible for that difference. We get this question a lot, which is why we use this as an example. Mr. Watkins, I've got a 1-bedroom voucher, but I want to stay in a 2-bedroom just because I want a 2-bedroom. Okay, you're free to do that. Just remember, you're going to pay the difference between the 1-bedroom voucher and the 2-bedroom rent. Within certain limits, we will allow you to do that. And I'm going to walk you through what those limits are and how we calculate those limits. That is done through what we call calculating your rent. All right. So this is how we determine, because this is the last question people ask mostly. I know how many vouchers, I know how many bedrooms I'm going to have in my voucher. Check. I know how much money I'm going to have in my voucher. Check. Now, Mr. Watkins, how much of the rent am I going to have to pay? What's my share of the rent? So this is what's called calculating your rent. And I'm going to walk you through how we do that. And we're going to use May as an example. All right. So there are a number of factors that go into calculating the rent that you'll pay for your unit. Okay. Some of these factors are listed here, and we're going to discuss them. There's first called gross income, adjusted income, deductions, total tenant payment, and then finally we get to tenant rent. So we calculate the amount that you pay in rent or the tenant rent based on your income, right? So we're going to walk through how that breaks down. First off, what is gross income? Gross income is the income before any deductions that come out of your check, such as taxes. Example, if your gross pay each week is $250, your annual gross income would be $13,000. Remember, full-time student wages, for full-time student wages, all but $480 in wages from adult full-time wage students who are not the head of house, co-head, or spouse are excluded from annual income. I'm going to read that again. Everything but $480 in wages from adult full-time students are excluded from annual income, as long as they're not the head, co-head, or spouse. All right. All income from assets is included in income. May's gross income. Let's look at May. She earns $320 per week at Walmart and receives $400 per month in Social Security payments for her son, Daniel. Her gross income would be $21,440. And this is how it breaks down. May, employment at Walmart, $320 times 52 weeks, $16,640. Daniel's Social Security income of $400 a month times 12 months is $4,800 a year. So the gross annual income is the $16,640 plus the $4,800, which equals $21,440 per year. We divide that by 12 months and we come up with May's monthly gross income of $17,870. Now we want to account or determine what is May's adjusted income. Adjusted income is calculated by taking your gross income from all sources and subtracting eligible deductions. So the following slides include the eligible deductions and the amounts that will be deducted. So dependent deductions. A $480 dependent deduction is given for each family member other than the head, co-head, or spouse who's under the age of 18 or older and a full-time student, or 18 or older and as a person with a disability. So we're going to deduct $480 for each dependent who falls into this category, okay, from the total household income. Elderly or disabled deductions. An elderly or disabled deduction of $400 per household is given to families whose head, co-head, or spouse is age 62 years or older and or is a person with a disability. Only one $400 deduction is applied per family. Here's some other deductions that could apply. Unreimbursed child care expenses. Child care expenses, unreimbursed, mind you, may be deducted for care of children under the age of 13 when child care provided allows an adult household member to work, attend school, or seek employment. So how much will be allowed? Up to the amount received for wages. Reasonable expenses given the hours the person is working in school or looking for work. Unreimbursed medical expenses. Here's another deduction. So medical expenses that are unreimbursed may be deducted for elderly or disabled households for amounts that exceed 3% of the total annual gross income for the household. For example, if you claim a copay for prescriptions or dental bill you paid, if it wasn't covered by dental insurance, then you can claim that. Once those expenses exceed 3% of the total annual gross income for the household, then you start deducting it. Another one, unreimbursed disability expenses. Again, if a family member with a disability to allow someone in the family to work, those expenses can be deducted. These expenses could be for a caregiver, as an example, okay? Or for equipment or apparatuses to allow a person with disabilities to work. Example is if you're physically disabled and need to purchase an adaptive keyboard to work, you could claim the cost of the keyboard as a disability assistance expense. So let's look at how this plays out for May. Let's assume in this case, May is not disabled. Remember though, May's gross income annually was $21,440. She has two dependents, 14-year-old and an 18-year-old who's a full-time student. So what can May receive? May receives a $480 deduction for each of her children. So the gross income, right, $21,440, annual income, right, minus the $960, the deductions for her two dependent sons, brings May's adjusted annual income to $20,480. We're going to divide that by 12 to come up with May's adjusted income of $1,707. Now remember, her child is 14, so she can't get reimbursement or a deduction for unreimbursed child care expenses because her son is over the age of 13. That only applies if you're 13 and under, okay? Remember, May is not elderly, so she doesn't get the elderly deduction of $400. And May is not disabled, so she doesn't get that disability deduction. Okay, nor is anyone in her household. So May's monthly adjusted income is 1707. So now we've heard gross income. Now we've got adjusted income. We've talked about the deductions that brought us to adjusted income. Now let's look at total tenant payment. What is total tenant payment, or what we call TTP? It's what you are responsible to pay towards your rent and utilities, and any additional amount you may have to pay if you rent a unit with gross rent that exceeds the payment standard. Remember we talked about that? Payment standard was for a 1-bedroom, but you want a 2-bedroom, and the gross and the rent for the 2-bedroom is more expensive than the payment standard, so you're responsible for the difference. That's what we're talking about when we say, and any additional amount you may have to pay if you rent a unit with gross rent that exceeds the payment standard. That's what we're talking about. All right. But keep in mind, it is the total tenant payment is the amount you are responsible to pay towards rent and utilities, right? So how do we determine total tenant payment? Now, it's either the highest of these three. It's either the highest of the minimum rent, which is $50. It's either 30% of your adjusted monthly income, or 10% of your gross monthly income. So we're going to look at what is the maximum between these three calculations. And that's how we're going to determine your TTP, your total tenant payment. So to determine May's TTP, we need to calculate 10% of her monthly gross income. So that's the first one in there. 10% of monthly gross income, remember, 1787, that's before any deductions. 10% of that is $179. Great, we did that calculation. Now we got to do the calculation of 30% of her monthly adjusted income. So 30% of May's monthly adjusted income, 1707 times 30%. That's $512. And then we have to say the minimum rent, which is $50. Now we're simply going to ask the question, which one is the highest of these three numbers? And the obvious answer is $512. So 30% of May's monthly adjusted income is her total tenant payment. That equals $512. So now we know May's total tenant payment. Remember, May's total tenant payment is the total amount of rent and utilities that May will have to pay. So generally, the tenant rent, now we've got what May's total tenant payment is. Now let's look at, well, how much of that will May have to pay versus what MHA pays, right? So now let's look at that. We call that tenant rent. So generally, the tenant rent to the owner is the total tenant payment minus the allowance for tenant paid utilities. So we're looking at total tenant payment. That is what May is going to have to put towards utilities and rent. The very first thing we're going to do, because we don't know where May is going to choose a place to live, right? May's going to get her voucher. May's going to be told your vouchers for 2 bedrooms. Here's the payment standard for the 2 bedrooms. May's going to want to ask that question right off the bat. Well, how much am I going to have to pay? Right? So here's how we calculate that and then provide to May an estimate of her tenant rent, her rent share. And this is how we provide you with an estimate. We do all these calculations. We come up with your total tenant payment. And then we subtract out of the total tenant payment an allowance for the tenant paid utilities. That's your utility allowance. And again, remember, we don't know the exact property you're going to live in at this point. So we're simply saying a 2-bedroom utility allowance is X number of dollars. We're going to subtract that out of the total tenant payment. And then the remainder will be what May's rent to owner is going to be, or May's rent share. So remember, if you choose to rent a unit where the rent and utility allowance exceeds the payment standard, not only will you have to pay your rent share, but you'll also have to pay an additional amount towards the rent to cover that difference. Let's look at the example. May's tenant rent is $512. Okay. However, because she found a unit where she is responsible for paying some of her utilities, her utility allowance will be subtracted from her total tenant payment. Remember, I just said that, right? To get her tenant rent portion. So May's portion that she's going to have to pay to the owner is $368. How do we know that? Because remember, we do utility studies every year, and we have a utility allowance schedule, right? And because May's received a 2-bedroom voucher, we can look on that utility schedule and say May's utility assistance is $144. We're going to take that $512 total tenant payment, subtract out the utility allowance. Remember, it's just an estimate because we don't know exactly where you're going to live initially, right? We take that $144 out, and then we're able to provide to May, your rent to owner is $368, and we're going to pay the difference. And we'll be able to say that to each of our participants at the time that they pick up their voucher. But again, remember, it's just an estimate. We actually get the real number when you submit a RAFTA, and then we say, oh, you found an apartment, okay, where someone else may have found a 3-bedroom home, single family home. Well, they might have completely different utilities. Hopefully that makes sense to you. And that's when we're able to really drill down to determine, well, now we know where you're living, and now we can tell you exactly how much your share of the rent is going to be. But on the front side, tomorrow or next week when you get your voucher, it'll just be an estimate, okay? So the housing assistance payment, or HAP, is the amount the agency pays to the owner for the rent that is not paid for by the family. So have we decided, have we told you yet what May's rent is? Yes, we have. We said her estimated rent is $368. Do we know how much the rent for the property she's going to live in is? Not yet, but it doesn't matter because we know what May's rent estimated initially, right, is going to be. And then the difference is going to be what we pay, which is the HAP. So now you've heard and understand the complete process from soup to nuts, from beginning to end, on our leasing process, subsidy standard, portability if you want to go somewhere else in the country or simply somewhere else in Alabama, outside of Mobile County. You understand subsidy standard and how we determine the size of your voucher. You understand payment standard and how we determine how much money goes into each of those vouchers. And now you've heard and you understand how we calculate your rent based on the income and ultimately the adjusted income you have. Now let's kind of rewind a little bit and deal with the housing search process, okay? So there's information that we can provide to you. There's websites available out here. Go Section 8, or what they call affordablehousing.com. These are places where you can go and seek out properties to find properties, seek out homes to find properties. There's Zillow, there's apartments.com, there's all kinds of websites, and just within the local Mobile marketplace where you can identify, rental housing, okay? When you found the unit you're interested in, you're going to want to contact the owner or the management company and arrange a time to view the unit. All right. This way you can look at the condition of the unit. You want to look at where the unit is located in proximity to public transportation, centers of employment, schools, shopping. Those are the kind of things you want to look at. Let me just also add, when you're looking at the condition of the unit, turn items on in the property. Make sure there's no leaking faucets underneath, the kitchen sink or the bathroom sink. Make sure the shower head works properly. You want to do these things as you walk through the property just to make sure that you don't have issues later on after you move in. It protects you and it lets the landlord know that this is not your first rodeo. You're really looking at properties to determine whether or not this is suitable for you. Okay. Here's just a few questions that you may want to ask the landlord when you give them a call. You want to certainly get the full address of the property. Okay. You want to know how many bedrooms are in the unit, how much the rent is for the unit. Is the rent more than the payment standard? You'll see that right on your voucher. You'll be able to compare that right away. Okay. What, if any, utilities are included in the rent? Get some history on how expensive the utilities have been. And this is a good one. Are there any special restrictions like no pets or no smoking or no parking on the grass? Or do I have to cut the grass? These are good questions to ask to know what you can anticipate and expect when you're going to go view that property. Unit modifications. If you need unit modifications because you have a disabled family member, please note that MHA does not make any modifications to the unit. Okay, an owner cannot refuse to permit unit modifications. However, sometimes they will require this to be done at the family's expense. Reasonable modifications to the unit to allow a person with disabilities to have full enjoyment of the unit. The owner may require that the family agree to restore the premises to the condition that existed prior to the modifications. An example may be adding a ramp at the front door of a unit. The owner cannot refuse to allow the ramp to be installed. However, the tenant may be required to pay for the ramp and installation, and the owner could also charge the tenant for the removal of the ramp. Okay. Opportunity neighborhoods. Studies have shown that when families move from high poverty to low poverty neighborhoods, some of the effects are these. Young children experience positive outcomes later on in life in their earnings, college education rates, and location outcomes. Adults experience positive outcomes in their overall well-being, family safety, mental health, and physical wellness. Now that you've selected a unit, you've gone out, you've done your housing search, you've selected a unit, I'm going to just recap what the process is prior to us closing this out so that you'll know what to do once you get that voucher and now you're out looking for property. Once you find a suitable home, you and your prospective landlord must complete the request for tenancy approval. This is going to be part of your voucher package. All the information must be completed and complete all required leasing forms. The agency will not accept incomplete leasing documents and information. When you or your landlord brings that information in, the very first thing we're going to do, typically before you leave, is to review the documentation to make sure it's correct and complete. If it is, then we'll accept it and re-review it. Okay. If it's something that we've identified right off the bat, then we're going to give it back to you, highlight the areas that need to be completed, and say, I'm sorry, we can't accept it. Please get this information completed, or Miss Landlord, please complete this information now, and then we can move forward, okay? You can only submit one rafter at a time. You might like 2 or 3 properties, but we can only accept one rafter at a time, okay? A second rafter may not be submitted until you have received notice that your initial request has been denied. HUD requires any apartment or rental home selected by an HCV participant to pass a rent reasonable review and a housing quality standards inspection before you move in. Please keep this in mind. Do not move into a property that has not completed these 2 items. If you do, we will not be responsible for the outcome and subsequent impact to you if the unit does not pass inspection. You sign a lease prior to us completing this process. We then complete this process and say the unit is denied. Unfortunately, you're on your own. We won't be able to do much for you. The lease is a legal document. You're obligated to do what the lease says. They're for 12 months. So if you sign on to this lease and you obligate yourself to this rent for 12 months prior to us thumbs up and say, yes, the unit is approved and the inspection is passed, and it doesn't pass and it's not approved, then you're on the hook for that. And there's not much we can do for you. Do not move into a property prior to us completing the rent reasonableness review and housing quality standards inspection. It is for your protection to follow the proper procedure. What are going to be some required documents for leasing? Most of these will be provided by the landlord, and it's a part of your package, okay? 7 steps required before move-in. Okay, I'm going through this and we're repeating some of this so that you get a thorough and full understanding of the process, so that you don't have any, well, what do I do now? I'm not sure what's happening. Here's what's happening. You're going to submit the rafter and the leasing forms to us. We're going to complete an inspection. We're going to do a rent review. Okay, if those things are good to go, thumbs up on both of those, it's been approved, then you're going to obtain, tenant obtain security deposit and first month's rent. You're going to give that to the landlord, okay? You're going to go ahead and get your utility accounts opened up for that property, sign your lease, move into your property. We're going to sign the HAP contract with the landlord, and guess what? We're going to start making payments. I've mentioned this word reasonable reasonable review a few times. So what is that? The contract rent is the rent charged by the owner for the unit. That rent must be approved. MHA must demonstrate that the rent being requested by the owner is 2 things. Number 1 is reasonable in comparison to the rent for other comparable unassisted units. That's number 1. And the rent does not result in you, the tenant, paying more than 40% of their adjusted monthly income toward the rent. Those are the 2 things that we're checking for. Again, we want to make sure that the rent is reasonable with other properties in the community. And number 2, that the tenant, you, are not paying more than 40% of your adjusted monthly income toward rent. MHA may negotiate with the owner to set an approvable rent. So if we do these 2 things and we determine that the rent is not acceptable because of one of these 2 reasons, then we will call up the landlord and say, your rent did not rate for either one of these two reasons. We'll do the calculation to determine what the rent needs to come down to, and we'll ask the landlord, will you be willing to reduce your rent to this level? Of course, they can say yes, or they can say no. If they say yes, then the lease is adjusted to reflect that rent. We sign a HAP contract and everything moves forward. If they say no, then unfortunately, you'll have to find a new property to rent. Let's look at an example on this. Remember May? Remember we left May, okay? May's monthly adjusted income is $1,707. We determined May's rent share is $368. Remember, that's where we left it. All right, now we've determined that May found a property, okay? If May rents a unit that is $350 over the payment standard, because remember, May wanted to rent a 3-bedroom, even though she only had a 2-bedroom voucher. So here's that example. If May rents a unit that's $350 over the payment standard for the jurisdiction where her housing authority is, May's rent would be $718. How do we calculate that? Well, $368, we know she's having to pay because that's her rent share. But in addition to that, May's rent was $350 over the payment standard. Well, guess what? May's responsible for that difference. So when you add those two amounts up, it comes up to $718. That's what May's going to have to pay. But we have to make sure that amount is not more than 40% of May's monthly adjusted income. So we do that calculation. And guess what we determined? $718 is actually 42% of May's monthly adjusted income. So guess what? The agency cannot approve the unit, even if the rent was determined to be reasonable. And what would we do? We would do the calculation to determine what the rent would have to come down to in order to be within 40% of May's monthly adjusted income. We do that calculation and ask the landlord, are they willing to drop the rent by however much that is to meet this requirement? If they say yes, then May can move forward. If they say no, then unfortunately May is going to have to find a new place. We do this calculation for every single person. Whether you're over the payment standard or not, we do this calculation for every single person. The housing quality standard inspection. All right. We're going to do this before the unit is approved for leasing. Once the MHA's inspection department makes every effort to get the initial inspection to occur within 15 business days after submission of the completed RAFTA. The owner must provide the MHA inspector with access to the unit. That's kind of obvious, right? We've got to have access to the unit to inspect it. Utilities must be turned on in the management company or owner's name for the inspection date. Remember, we're only saying this because we want to remind you not to get units, utilities turned on in your name. It must be in the name of the management company or the owners when we do the inspection, okay? Just some common reasons that HQS inspections fail, all right? There's a non-working smoke detector or carbon monoxide detector. There's cracking, scaling, or peeling paint, okay? Bedrooms have not at least one operable window for ventilation, okay? And rooms lack 2 or more working outlets and a permanent light fixture. These are just some reasons that we list to give you an understanding of what to look for and what we're going to look for when we go through the process. Timeline for inspection approval. An owner should generally complete any repairs as soon as possible, generally no later than 30 days from the date of the failed inspection. If upon re-inspection, the unit fails the inspection, the unit will not be approved and you need to move on to try to find something new. Security deposit and other upfront costs. The owner of the property will very likely request from you a security deposit. Okay, they could also say we want a portion of the last month's rent. All right, families, so just keep in mind, you'll need to be prepared for that, including security deposits, pet deposits, things like that as well. All right, make sure that you read your lease. Make sure that you read your lease. Make sure that you read your lease. Okay, the lease is going to include HUD required tenancy addendum. Okay, when the unit has passed inspection and the rent is approved, then you'll sign your lease. And you'll provide a copy of that lease to MHA, and then we'll sign the HAP contract with the landlord. Never pay the owner an amount that is different from your tenant rent. Okay, collecting a side payment from the HVC from HCV program participants is a serious offense and is punishable under federal law. Don't make any outside agreements to pay the landlord something that's not a part of your lease agreement, and certainly not that is more than what your tenant rent is. Okay, the landlord asks you to do that, please let us know. Some additional fees such as parking, sometimes apartment complex will have a share of the utilities, or maybe they'll have a share of the cable fee or something like that. If that's typical for the area, then that's allowed. It just needs to all be reflected as part of the rent, and you need to make sure that you're aware of what those fees are and that they're included in your lease so that you can be prepared to pay them. Remember, utilities, just a few reminders, you're responsible for your utility payments. You've got to get them in your name, okay? Landlord will tell you where the utility companies are for that property, or who they are for that property. You need to have it, your utilities in your name within 10 days of moving in, okay, after you move in. All right. Once the HAP contract is signed by the owner and returned to us, we'll begin to make HAP payments. Here's some of your responsibilities. Comply with the program requirements, pay your portion of the rent on time, maintain your condition maintain your unit in good condition. People get evicted for two reasons: non-payment of rent, and they don't take care of their property. People get terminated from the program for two reasons: non-payment of rent, they don't get paid, they don't take care of their unit, right? And the last reason people get terminated from the program is that they don't comply with program requirements. One of those program requirements is that annually, every single year, you have to recertify for continued eligibility in the program. So your responsibility to be on top of that. Your responsibility to be on top of that. You have to recertify in this program every 12 months. We will send you out a reminder via email and snail mail. It's not our responsibility to make sure you get the email. It's our responsibility, and we do send the email. It's your responsibility to make sure you get the email and the snail mail, meaning mail through post office, and then that you respond accordingly. Lastly, follow the terms of your lease. Okay? Make sure that you respond to agency appointments by providing us with the required information. Okay? When you're ready to move out of your unit, make sure you notify the agency and your landlord in writing prior to your move out, generally 60 days in advance. You can go online to receive a notice to vacate, print that down, complete the requirements on that, submit it both to your landlord for signature and then to the housing authority. That's how we're notified that you want to move. That's how we're able to get you out a new voucher so that you can begin to look for a new property. Make sure that you take care of the unit. Landlords don't want to send you a good recommendation if you are not, and I mean a good recommendation, meaning signing off on your notice to vacate. They don't want to do that if you've torn up their unit. If you have abused their unit, then you'll be terminated from the program. Okay, make sure you take care of the unit. I've mentioned this termination from assistance. If you commit any serious or repeated violations of the lease, if you sublet your unit or rent out your unit, okay, to someone else, if you engage in any drug-related, violent, or other criminal activity, if you receive other housing subsidy from a duplicate housing program, okay, or if you permit unauthorized persons to live in your unit, these are all grounds for termination. Informal review and informal hearings are allowed for applicants. We will do an informal review to ensure that your denial of admission or termination of assistance was proper. For participants, an informal hearing, if you don't agree with an agency determination, generally these things are calculation of annual or adjusted income or use of such income to compute your rent, or termination of assistance for failure to follow program requirements. These are all reasons that you could be terminated, and here's your recourse. You have 15 days from the date of adverse action to request an informal hearing or an informal review. So hopefully we have gone through now all of the program requirements. We've gone through the lease-up process. I'll mention one other thing. We conduct housing quality standard inspections after you move in once every 2 years. It's a requirement of HUD that we do that, and we do it. Please make sure that you allow access to the property so that we can do that inspection. Okay, we have to do that inspection with someone who is over the age of 18. We cannot do that with a minor in the house. They have to be 18 years or older. So that's the last thing I'll mention. Thank you for your attention. We will now address questions and we'll stop our recording. Thank you very much for attending today's session.